What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony, let's jump in. The Chinese property market is really feeling the pain. According to the latest data released on Monday, the number of cities where new home prices recorded monthly increases fell for the 5th month in a row, from 27 to 13 in September, while the number of cities where prices of second-hand homes increased fell to only 4. The 0.2% drop in new home prices in October was the biggest fall seen in China since February 2015. It was actually in 2015 when China saw its last property crisis. In the end, with that crisis, Beijing ended up turning to cheap credit and stimulus. In a country where the property sector contributes 25 to 30% of economic growth, this slowdown we've seen in the last few months will be hitting many regions very hard. Local governments will be very tempted to either 1, support local property developers, or 2, pour money into unneeded and unproductive infrastructure. In fact, Chinese financial media over the weekend reported that 21 Chinese cities have recently issued policies to, quote, stem declines in residential property prices, end quote. And these cities are not just low-tier cities either. For example, the massive city of Wuhan, provincial capital of Hubei province, just announced that it is dropping strict requirements on non-residents buying houses there to support the local property industry. We know that land sales, that is the sale of the right to use the land for a period of time, represents the biggest source of income for local governments. One question asked when the crackdown on private property developers started was, how will local governments replace falling revenue? Well, according to new data over the past 3 months, state-owned developers have brought 3/4 of residential land sold at auctions by value. In the past, this rate was only 45% of land sold at auctions. So there is our answer. Moving from local government to central government now, we already know from last Friday's episode that there is strong evidence to suggest that Beijing, that is the central government, has already blinked and is starting to ease growth constraints on the property sector in order to hit politically acceptable growth levels in 2022. Investors seem to think so too, with property stocks seeing the largest 2-day price increase in 5 years late last week. Now, we've been following developments with Evergrande with every episode now, but for those of you who have not seen the last few episodes, this is what you need to know regarding the property developer. Last week, Evergrande avoided default on overdue interest payments of $148 million, although there is some dispute around this payment that is still up in the air. Just days before this payment, it sold its 5.7% stake in media firm Hengteng Networks Group for $145 million. A few days before that, it sold its UK-based electric car business. We don't know for how much, that has not been disclosed. Evergrande is still facing challenges meeting its financial obligations, with hundreds of millions of US dollars worth of payments still due by the end of the year. Of course, other property developers are having liquidity issues too. We have been following Kaisa Group very closely, for example, on here. As this crisis continues, we will continue following Evergrande and the property sector generally. Dozens of cities across the country remain in varying levels of lockdown, as the current now month-long Delta outbreak has still not been stamped out. Though it has not blown up to a national crisis level, dozens of new cases are discovered in different locations each day, and millions are affected by the costly restrictions as China still pursues a zero-cases strategy. The total of local cases officially reported since October 17th is nearing 1,500. One piece of good news is that most new cases are now concentrated in one region, the northeastern city of Dalian. Neighboring cities are now putting in quarantine arrivals from Dalian for 14 days before allowing them to move around freely. In Dalian, schools have been closed and almost 1 million people, about 1/8 of the entire population of the city, are now confined to their homes. One university is also in complete lockdown. The city of Beijing is getting stricter too. Starting tomorrow, most domestic travelers into Beijing will need to present a negative COVID test from the prior 48 hours and will have to provide their green health code too. This is a type of COVID passport in order to enter the city. On Monday, US time, General Secretary Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden had their third conversation in 10 months. The two sides met virtually for about 3.5 hours. US officials told US media that the talks were, quote, meant to reassure both sides that misunderstandings would not lead to unintended clashes, end quote. The White House readout expressed that both sides have disagreements over many issues, including, quote, the Taiwan situation, the militarization of the South China Sea, and cybersecurity, end quote. The Chinese Foreign Ministry described the exchange as a, quote, candid, in-depth, and thorough discussion, end quote, unquote, strategic issues affecting the future of bilateral relations, as well as important issues of mutual interest and concern, end quote. So very standard language employed there, but still constructive. During the meeting, General Secretary Xi Jinping called Biden, quote, my old friend, end quote, and said that two countries should work together. So far, state media in the mainland has adopted cautiously optimistic language in its coverage of the meeting, with the phrase, quote, build consensus, end quote, appearing frequently. My analysis would be the best thing to expect from a successful exchange here is the setting up of guardrails to prevent unintended serious escalations in the future, and perhaps some limited cooperation on things like climate policy. But that said, do not expect a general warming in relations. Both sides distrust each other and see the relationship as one now defined by competition. Over the last few months, we have seen and discussed what looks to be the beginning of a new global PR campaign that Beijing wants to push to challenge the definition of democracy. Specifically, it wants to present what the party argues is an alternative form of democracy, which Beijing calls, quote, whole process democracy, end quote. The idea to be pushed internationally is not only that the so-called whole process democracy is a legitimate form of democracy, but it is superior to Western or US-style democracies. Indeed, this is what China expert and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, wrote in an opinion piece with the Wall Street Journal only yesterday. Quote, it offers the developing world a new model that China believes works, as opposed to the democratic world's model that it says doesn't, as demonstrated by what China argues is its superior response to COVID-19. It boasts of the Marxist basis of that model, end quote. Last week, Beijing hosted the critical 6th Plenum, which we discussed in the last two episodes. At a special press conference after the Plenum, top leaders spoke on the 4-day event, and this idea of whole process democracy and its superiority over Western alternatives or Western democracy once again came up. The director of the Policy Research Office of the Communist Party of China's Central Committee, a senior ideology official, expressed, quote, the US will host a so-called democracy summit that seeks to revive Western democracy, and it's a huge irony to host it against the mounting problems faced by Western democracy, end quote. He went on to say, quote, democracy is not a patent of the West, nor can it be defined by the West. Western democracy is a democracy dominated by capital, a democracy of the rich, not true democracy, end quote. This, of course, is not a new critique of what may be called Anglo-liberal democracy or Anglo-capitalist democracy. Marxists, fascists, anarchists, and others have made similar criticisms for almost 2 centuries now, becoming especially mainstream in the West in the 1930s, in the 1960s, and perhaps again today. Now, the official moved on to what the party argues is the superior strength of the Chinese whole process democracy, expressing, quote, democracy is not for decoration, but for solving people's problems, end quote. And he concluded with, quote, the Chinese people have a high degree of confidence in their political system, and the fundamental reason lies in the fact that the whole process people's democracy is highly democratic, fully fledged, and deeply welcomed by the Chinese people. This is true people's democracy, end quote. Now, this sort of rhetoric is quite common domestically, but it increasingly looks like Beijing is preparing to aggressively push this PR campaign globally in the near future. Hey guys, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to hit that like button. It's a massive help for a small YouTuber like myself. If you're watching this for the first time and you're enjoying the content, you're getting some value from the material, from the analysis, maybe consider subscribing, hit that bell notification, and you'll have the most up-to-date analysis when it's published. And as always, a massive thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys rock. Thank you so much for supporting this small channel. It really means a lot. Cheers. On Monday, the Beijing Equity Exchange office opened officially. The new exchange is the third in mainland China and is intended as a platform to house small and medium-sized companies that have long faced difficulties raising capital because they are not big enough to list in Shanghai or Shenzhen. With a 200 million RMB, approximately $31 million minimum market capitalization requirement, the Beijing exchange intends to provide easier access to listings than Shanghai's Nasdaq-style Star Board. With the Monday launch, 71 companies migrated from existing Chinese boards and 100 companies listed for the first time. This is just a fraction of the number of companies listed in Shanghai or Shenzhen. However, it does represent a step forward for Beijing's attempts to expand its domestic capital markets and pull the balance of power in global capital markets closer to its side of the Pacific Ocean. Okay guys, that is this episode of China Update. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you throw your comments below. As always, I always love hearing from you guys. Wherever you are, I hope you're keeping safe and keeping sane. I will see you next time on China Update.